in terms of Logica, I guess my concern there is that to view the end result of using reason as truth goes back to the starting point as far as where you start. Let me give you a paradigm. If I say that, or as some evangelicals do, that Mormonism is a cult. Mitt Romney is a Mormon.
Yes.
Therefore, it's true that Mitt Romney is a member of a cult.
Yeah.
Now, is that true?
Well,
I mean, it's certainly logical.
Yeah, I think this is a rhetorical question from a philosopher. The thing that people overlook in a logical argument is that if your premises are false,
right,
your conclusion is going to be false.
That's correct.
And you start with established premises that are either established through logic or axiomatic truth that is established because it is patently obvious, such as a geometric axiom states that of a group of parallel lines, only one can pass through a point, an arbitrary point. Only
yes.
one of them can pass through that point.
Right.
Now, that is intuitively true, and we accept those as the basis for starting to develop something like geometric theorems. We start with these things that are axiomatically true. In fact, Aristotle argued that you must start with axiomatic truth.
Mm-hmm.
We today are more confident starting with empirical truth.
Mm-hmm.
That if we take something like cigarette smoking greatly increases your chance of getting lung cancer. We're very comfortable accepting that, not because of our personal experience with
mm-hmm.
it. After all, the 99-year-old fellow who smokes a pack a day is always called up in defense of tobacco. But we argue it because the scientific community has agreed that it is true on the basis of hard won data. That
mm-hmm.
it's rigorous study of this subject, collection of data, analysis of it, publication of it in refereed journals where others read their work and decide it's valid. So we get very confident today in that, whereas if you had made this case in Aristotle's time, it would have been far more iffy if you had said, for example, the sun rises and crosses over the earth each day. It might have seemed scientifically true. That is, you could study that movement of the sun
mm-hmm.
crossing every day.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we know today that the earth revolves. It isn't the case that the sun moves around the earth. We know that today, but they did not know that in Aristotle's time, and you could understand why they might have assumed that to be true. And so we're more confident today about empirical truth. So we use it, philosophy leans on it heavily to make its arguments today, whereas going back 300 or 400 years, philosophers would have been more likely to have leaned on mystica truth. In other words, if you were a 17th century philosopher in the Western world, no doubt you would have felt like you could state one thing for sure: God exists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Today, that might be viewed by a philosopher as something that needed qualified,
mm-hmm.
and at least qualified, if not rejected. We have no basis for that other than mystica and the prophets, what the prophets have told us, or any rhetorical argument made to defend it. But I think for the two of us, we would agree that E equal mc squared is acceptable truth. We would agree with all the basic axioms of geometry. So we would have a basis to start from. Now, how you get from there to saying something meaningful that people can use every day is the art of philosophy. It's the trying to get from what we know logically to a conclusion, and it has to be logical. There's one thing to start with true premises. It's another to treat them with rigorous logic so that your conclusion is true. So you have to have both good logic, true premises.
Well, your true premises is the question I have, because it sounds as if what you're basically doing is making empirica the basis of all these others. I mean, it sounds as if that's the ultimate appeal. I mean, particularly in terms of verifying premises. For the premises to be legitimate, for it to be truthful, it's almost has to be based on empirica?
Well, Logica makes that decision. If you're in a class on a college campus,
right,
you quickly ascertain where the truths are coming from. If it's a course in theology, he's going to or she's going to be very logical about this.
Yes.
But the truths are likely to come from the prophets. Whereas in a course titled Physics, the teacher is going to be very logical, very rational, but they're going to only accept physical research as the basis for their discussions. If you get into a class that's more freewheeling, like a class called Logic, they're going to start with a lot of axiomatic truths, for sure, but they will borrow from any one of the domains for stipulated truth for the sake of teaching. They will say, let us stipulate that smoking causes cancer. They won't necessarily affirm it. They'll leave it to empirica to affirm it, but they're willing to take it to stipulate this is true, to teach people how to reason. And that makes philosophy and science sort of in a family. Logica and empirica have always found great fondness for the other.
Yes.
And that was the way it evolved. I don't think it necessarily had to be that way. For many years, science wasn't well enough developed to attract the philosophers. It was called natural philosophy at one time and viewed as more iffy. But in philosophy, we will let people stipulate even symbolic things like, let us stipulate A greater than B.
Yes.
We don't know what A and B are, but we're willing to stipulate it for the sake of logical reasoning. So philosophy can start anywhere, but philosophers of the 20th century have been drawn into accepting scientific truth to a large extent, I think. And accordingly, scientists try to be as reasonable as they can. They work at being logical. Unfortunately, philosophers have very little training in science, and scientists have very little training in philosophy, so often they fail at these two tasks.
Well, that raises another question for me, and that is, isn't there something out there called reality that is really the basis of truth finally, and doesn't that finally make empirica the basis for the other domains?
Well, if you wanted
that.
If you wanted to go into empirica and accept what they accept, that there is a reality and it's out there and we can understand it by experimentation and research, welcome to empirica. Don't try that in the seminary.
No, I'll exclude Mystica.
Okay,
you're right about Mystica,
and you can't even be sure that in a humanities class or even a philosophy class that they will buy that. There have been philosophers that argued that all they could be sure of was that that their mind existed, that their experience of the world existed. They couldn't be sure of anything they experienced. They could only be sure of experience as they knew it in their mind. That extreme philosophy rejects reality as a place to start from. And it's a legitimate philosophy that you can't say that philosophy is wrong. You can only say it is based on a beginning point that most philosophers would not go to. Although I have heard modern philosophers argue time and time again that experience is primitive knowledge, that you start with your own experience, or with human experience as being the basis you work from. But I think that the problems that we face in deciding where to start and with what assumptions depends entirely upon which domain we select to enter to search for truth. If you're a student and you enter in a physics class, and you say, I reject the notion that there is an ultimate reality, and therefore this is just a likely story that I'm learning here, it will be hard for you to advance in physics. But if you enter with the basic assumptions of a great scientist like Richard Feynman, that we're not looking for the truth, we're just looking for the probabilities that this statement is true. Evidently we've not pleased the gods here. Or either there's some physical reason for this in reality.
I'm sure there is.
But a lot of people reject, oh my goodness, it's coming and going.
Maybe I want to cut it off.
Anyway, the problem is which domain do you enter for your starting point. And if you enter the domain of empirica and you say, I don't believe there is a reality, you'll be hard-pressed to move on. If you enter mystica and you say, I've got to have experimental proof of everything that I'm taught, it's not going to be a comfortable place for you. I think of the college student who enters rejecting reasoning, rejecting logic, and they have such a poor welcome in the classroom when they ask the question, well, how do you know E equal MC squared, or how do you know that cigarette smoking causes cancer? How do you know these things? And they reject both the scientific and the logical arguments. They're going to be very uncomfortable in college.
I agree.